Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Low Carbon Fuels, Securing Our Fuel Future. I'm Shahana McKenzie, the CEO of Bioenergy Australia, and we are the peak industry body for Australia's future bioeconomy. Today, we're diving into one of the most important and timely challenges for Australia, how we strengthen fuel security while accelerating low carbon fuels. Before we begin, I would like to pay my respects to the local Indigenous people here in Canberra, the traditional custodians of the land that I'm on, which is the land of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. And I'd like to recognise the lands in which everybody is coming to from today. A few housekeeping items to get us started. Please make sure you introduce yourself and where you are watching from in the chat box, and use the Q&A box for any questions for our speakers. We're going to run through the speakers one after another, and then we will have the discussion at the end. So please pop those questions in as they come to you, and I'll get to those at the end. Also, just letting you know that today's session is being recorded and will be shared with attendees and will be available on Bioenergy Australia's YouTube page afterwards. So we are pleased to bring together this incredible panel, and I would like to thank them for joining us. This has been pulled together pretty quickly, and so it was great that they were all making themselves available, which is great. So we have 5 speakers and then the Q&A at the end. And to kick things off, I am delighted to introduce Jo Fowles from Deloitte, who is going to give us insights from the report that Bioenergy Australia commissioned, Securing Our Fuel Future, Resilience Through Low Carbon Liquid Fuels. Welcome, Jo.
Excellent. Good morning, everyone. Thanks very much for having me today. My name's Jo. I'm Director in the Energy and Climate team in Deloitte, specialising in public policy. And as a former political staffer, I always get excited when federal budget week comes around. So this webinar is really well timed, and it's a real pleasure to be with you. As Shahana says, the next few minutes, I'll give a sort of whistle-stop tour through Deloitte and Bioenergy Australia's report on securing our fuel future. Now, this report was written around a year ago, but it's so relevant to the situation we're facing today because many of the risks that were warned about in this work have really materialized over the past couple of months, and the need for action has really only increased. So today I'm going to talk briefly about the challenge, but also importantly the opportunity. And I'll start with the challenge. You know, as we've all experienced, Australia is hugely dependent on imported liquid fuels. These imports are really highly concentrated from a few supplier nations in Asia. And even if we can rapidly scale up electrification, and we need to, we're still going to have critical sectors of the economy dependent on liquid fuels for many years to come. The good news that I'll go into is that we have a pathway to address this. We have a strong pipeline of low carbon liquid fuel projects here in Australia that not only provide an opportunity to secure our supply chains and improve our economic resilience, but can also provide good jobs in regional and rural Australia and reduce our emissions at the same time. So to start with the challenge, as I said, Australia imports around 56 billion litres of liquid fuels each year, worth over $50 billion. And 90% of that comes from refineries in Asia, and 60% is derived from Middle Eastern crude. And within that, there are some really significant individual country concentrations. 35% of our diesel from South Korea, 30% of our jet fuel from China. And this dependence on individual nations has been reflected in some of the sort of diplomacy and trips that we've seen in recent weeks. You know, the foreign minister in Japan, South Korea, China, the PM in Singapore and Brazil. And if we think that impacts of the conflict in the Middle East have been really significant, things could potentially be even more challenging if there were supply disruptions in the South China Sea because of the nature of Australia's imports. The chart on the left-hand side of this page shows the various sectors of the economy where liquid fuels are used, as well as the extent to which that fuel use has been going up or down in recent years. At the top of the chart, we can see passenger vehicles, and then further down, sort of in the middle, light commercial vehicles. Together, they're about 30% of our liquid fuel demand. We know the solution for those sectors is electrification, and that's great. However, there's some important sectors towards the top of this chart that simply can't electrify so easily. So I'm talking about aviation, about mining, and about heavy freight. Together, over 40% of our liquid fuel demand. And their fuel use, in some cases, has actually been growing in recent years, even as electrification and efficiency technologies come online. So even as our economy decarbonizes and electrifies, some of these key sectors, aviation, mining, and heavy freight, are likely to remain dependent on liquid fuels for some time. So this graph shows the breakdown of Australia's liquid fuel demand between 2030 and 2050. And you can see aviation share at the bottom in the dark green, heavy freight is the second one up, and then mining in the sort of light teal, and then all other sectors of the economy in grey. And what you see is that those three sectors, aviation, heavy freight, and mining, they aren't able to reduce their liquid fuel demand so much between now and 2050. And by 2050, we see around 80% of our total liquid fuel demand is concentrated in those three sectors of the economy. And supply shocks like the one we're seeing right now, they don't just affect those sectors. It's the downstream industries that rely on them that are impacted as well, whether it's tourism in the case of aviation, pharmaceuticals, food, consumer goods in the case of heavy freight. These are three sectors. They aren't just big consumers of liquid fuels. They really underpin our economy and critical supply chains within it. So that's our kind of liquid fuel challenge in a nutshell. And now to move on to the opportunity ahead of us, because low carbon liquid fuels like sustainable aviation fuel and renewable diesel are a really unique opportunity for Australia. Low carbon liquid fuels are what's called a sort of drop-in alternative to conventional fossil fuels, be it jet fuel or diesel. They're pretty much, in many cases, indistinguishable in terms of chemical structure. They're similar energy densities, and this means they can be used as a like-for-like replacement, either entirely or in blended form. And this makes them really a ready-made solution for some of the fuel security challenges that I spoke about earlier. Low carbon liquid fuels are made from either biogenic feedstock, so your wastes or biomass, and can also be made from sort of non-biomass resources by combining sort of hydrogen and carbon dioxide. And there are various sort of pathways to create these fuels. The graph on screen shows some of these pathways, and importantly, the breakdown of their costs between sort of capex at the bottom, feedstock, opex, and then interest and tax. And from left to right, we've got HEFA, most advanced pathway in many cases, alcohol to jet, Fischer-Tropsch, and power to liquids. And across these pathways, whilst technological development is ongoing in some cases, technology isn't necessarily the key barrier we're looking to navigate when scaling up a low carbon fuels industries. All of these technologies have been demonstrated to a varying degree. Industry, this is more about sort of getting the price right, getting offtake right, and getting industry development policy in place. Now, as I said, this chart shows the cost breakdown for these fuels, and the key thing about their production costs is that they're largely driven by the cost of the feedstock. So that's the sort of light green section in the middle of the charts. And on average, that feedstock cost is something like 60 to 80% of the total production cost of low carbon liquid fuels. So that means if you're a country that's got low cost feedstock, and you can produce it close to where the fuel refining happens, and the fuel consumption happens, you've got a great chance of being competitive in low carbon liquid fuel production. And the good news for Australia is that we are already a leading producer of these feedstocks, and this puts us in a great position to develop a domestic low carbon liquid fuel industry. So some of the types of feedstocks that could be used are shown on the left-hand side of the chart. You've got things like agricultural residues to municipal solid waste, canola, sugarcane. In a bunch of these, Australia's got a big feedstock advantage. In fact, our current feedstock capacity is around 40 times our current fuel market requirements. So we've got lots of spare capacity, which could be deployed in terms of a domestic industry. Right now, that feedstock advantage hasn't translated into domestic LCLF production. Instead, we're exporting a bunch of these commodities. So we export 70% of our canola, 80% of our used cooking oil. And in fact, a lot of that export, or a good share of that export, actually goes into making fuels, low carbon liquid fuels for European markets. So we're not doing that sort of domestic refining onshore. Australia's kind of competitive edge extends beyond volume of feedstock to sustainability credentials as well, because Australian grown feedstocks have a higher abatement potential per tonne compared to global markets because of our world-leading agricultural sector and the types of practices that they use. So finally, what could this feedstock availability mean when it comes to securing our fuel future? Well, first, if we can accelerate the refining and deployment of low carbon liquid fuels in Australia, produce them domestically here rather than exporting the feedstock overseas, we could displace something like 20% of Australia's fuel imports by 2040 and 47% by 2050. Now, that is a huge fuel security opportunity, and we have many of the projects ready and waiting to take advantage of that. So this chart shows the pipeline of operational in the light green, in the dark green, and planned low carbon liquid fuel facilities in Australia as of last year, and the little white bar is current sustainable aviation fuel demand. As you can see, Australia on the right-hand side, we've got a significant pipeline around 2,000 megalitres, equivalent to fueling our rail and maritime sectors for a year. That's a pipeline similar to South Korea and Japan, much bigger than India and Malaysia. And what's it worth? Well, our work with the Clean Energy Finance Corporation suggests that market opportunity could be around $36 billion in 2050. That's regional jobs, it's economic security, it's sovereign industrial capability here in Australia, and it's securing our fuel future. If you want to learn more, check out the report, ask us some questions, and look forward to the other presentations today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joe. Really appreciate it. I'm now delighted to introduce Keith Sharp from TFA Project Group to speak on the recent white paper, The Role of Low Carbon Liquid Fuels in Australia's Fuel Security. And this is taking us from Joe kind of looking at the long-term opportunity and the projects moving into the future. And Keith's really going to talk about the immediacy of the role that we could be playing right now. So over to you, Keith.
Good morning, and thanks for the opportunity to talk today. I'm Keith Sharp, Engineering Manager at TFA Project Group. We specialise in the design of fuel infrastructure and have been designing fuel facilities across the Australian continent for 30 years. We've also been heavily involved in the rollout and implementation of biofuels, and we've released a series of white papers over the last few years, the last one being low carbon liquid fuels and potential feedstocks. And we revisited that recently with the fuel security issues to release a white paper on fuel security and the role of low carbon liquid fuels. And you can see the address of our website there if you want to download it. So the short answer is there's no magic solution. There's no panacea where a single solution is going to fix our fuel security. It's a matter of a multifaceted approach we believe, to actually make a difference, and a variety of approaches. So obviously we have 2 refineries left in Australia of note, plus the Eromanga facility in Queensland. But Viva Geelong and Ampol Lytton supply about 21% of Australia's fuel needs. However, currently, we've only got 3% of our known commercially viable crude reserves left, and 83% of the crude oil to run these refineries is imported. We are aware of some new reserves, such as the Taroom Trough, but the size of that and duration is still yet to be determined, and it's still yet to be developed. But we do know that we've got 10 billion litres of condensate that we currently export. So one of the opportunities is certainly to try and make those existing refineries that we have left, the 2 remaining left, make them domestically supplied so that we improve the fuel security, at least for those 2 refineries. We do have a strategic fuel storage. However, it is small by international standards. We're the only country member of the IEA who doesn't comply with the 90-day obligation. And we're down around 25, 30 days. All the other countries have over 90. But the challenge to actually meet that 90 days is not simple. It would require something like over 340 30 million litre tanks just to comply with our 90-day obligation. Now, to put that in context, in the last 3 to 4 years, there's been a government program to expand diesel storage for the equivalent of approximately 25 tanks. And the industry has struggled to build those 25 tanks in 3 years. So to build another 340 is not something that could be achieved tomorrow, even if the money was there. It takes time to develop and design these facilities. It's certainly worthwhile doing, but it's not something that can be achieved quickly. We can certainly continue to promote electric vehicles. They're actually starting to accelerate now. And by the graph there, you can see that we're up to a stage of where 1/3 of all vehicles are either hybrids or electric. And they are making a difference. Roughly 5% reduction in fuel usage because of electric vehicles on our roads. And ultimately, by 2050, they will make a big impact. But it will be progressive, and it's not going to impact, as Joe was saying, heavy transport, aviation and shipping. And ultimately, we're still going to have a very substantial liquid fuel demand by 2050. So certainly we have existing biorefineries. There are 6 of them in the country, but they're heavily underutilised. We have the potential to maximise the use of those refineries to get an equivalent 10 days cover of petrol and just over a day of diesel through the adoption of E10 and B5 by using those refineries to the maximum production. That means demand drivers to make it possible to blend those fuels into our petrol and diesel supplies, but it does give us additional, very quick supplies in our market that are independent of crude oil and have sustainable feedstocks that are Australian grown. There's certainly been mention of new crude oil refineries, but in the year 2000, we had 8 refineries and almost domestically secure. And it's basically been industry closing those refineries as those refineries were deemed small by international standards and uneconomic. So when we talk about new crude oil refineries, it begs the question, who will develop them and how will they improve fuel security unless we're sure that we've got crude oil reserves to drive them? And that's certainly far from certain at the moment. And so internationally, there's only been 1 refinery built in the last 20 years, which is this one here in Nigeria. It's basically not the international trend. And I don't think we've got the crude oil to drive them at this point in time. At best, it's a long-term strategy. However, we do have the opportunity to expand our biofuels industry. And this is what the rest of the world has been doing for the last 25 years. But we have built 1 biorefinery in 25 years. The rest of the world has built 950. 600 ethanol plants, 100 billion litres of ethanol blended into petrol around the world. 350 biodiesel plants with 40 billion litres of biodiesel blended into diesel around the world. Malaysia has B20 as standard, Indonesia B35, USA, Canada and Europe are all adopting E10. So this is not something new. This is something the rest of the world has been doing for 25 years. And we've been complacent during that period of time. So this is something we can do very quickly. The technology is proven, bankable, and relatively quick to implement by alternatives. We have the domestics to do this very easily. And an E10 and B5 mandate across the economy would give us the equivalent of another 36 days cover of petrol and 18 days of diesel, which is quite substantial. The other thing with biodiesel is that there is room to grow very easily. A lot of the buses on our roads, for instance, all the Scania buses, are already B100 compatible. You can run them on 100% biodiesel or 100% diesel. There's at least half a dozen manufacturers, major manufacturers of prime movers, who will sell you off the shelf today a B100 compatible prime mover. So there is the opportunity to get prime movers that can run on normal diesel, B5, B10, or even B100 to actually grow our resilience of fuel security in the country. There's certainly been a few options mentioned. One of the options was a gas to liquid plant, and there are a few of these operating around the world. The most recent and largest in the world was the one in Qatar. However, even though it's the largest in the world, it's only roughly the size of one of our existing refineries at Viva Geelong, for instance. Very similar production capacity. However, it is incredibly far more expensive technology, and it would also need to be located where our gas reserves are, which means it would be in remote locations, which are very expensive to build. It's also difficult with our gas structure because a lot of our gas is already dedicated to overseas contracts, and it's actually not cheap. So this could be done, but it's not deemed to be something we could achieve quickly. They've got a 10-year development period, and it's probably a lot more expensive than other alternatives. What the rest of the world is pursuing is low carbon liquid fueled refineries. ICAO lists 118 operational sustainable aviation fuel plants worldwide, with 570 announced. It's the only path to decarbonise aviation and to get fuel security for the aviation industry, and that's very critical to Australia. We use 10 billion litres a year of aviation fuel here. There are a variety of technologies. The HEFA technology is the most popular to date, but there's a lot of alternative technologies coming through with alcohol to jet, Fischer-Tropsch, and power to liquids e-fuels. And the technologies have the flexibility to produce plastics feedstocks as well as conventional fuels. So this is where the world is recognising the future is, because it's got the flexibility, and we are in a unique position here where we have the feedstocks to actually implement these projects. And biofuels from first generation can only go so far because largely they're blend fuels. These are drop-in fuels, which are fuels that can be implemented across the economy and replace existing fuels. So this is certainly where the world is heading as the future. And we have a number of projects under development, but they need support to actually be implemented. So in conclusion, a multifaceted approach is the only way forward to make quick results. Maximising the use of existing biofuels refineries makes sense to give you quick improvements in cover. Making our existing refineries operate on domestic crude or processed condensate that's available locally will help our security as a baseline for our fuel supplies. Expanding storage progressively to meet the IEA obligation is a good idea, but it won't happen in a hurry. I suspect we're talking 20 to 30 years to build that many storage tanks. It's a long-term target. New biofuels plants for Generation 1 make sense. They're regional, they create jobs, and we can get them to the point of E10 and B5 across the economy. Continue to encourage electric vehicles is good, but it's a long-term, slow burn project. And then the one that we are seeing that the rest of the world is adopting and makes a lot of sense in Australia because of our feedstock situation is low carbon liquid fuel refineries, which will give us aviation and diesel fuel security in a long time. Just to finish off with the key with all of this is demand drivers are critical. Without them, these things don't happen. And the reason 64 countries have succeeded in 25 years and we haven't is the governments have put in place mandates to drive these industries. Progressive requirements with scale-up blending of these sort of fuels is really critical to making progress. We have a mechanism called the fuel determination, which is a federal document to drive the component of our petrol and diesel. And I feel that modifying these documents to drive these industries is really key to making progress. So if you're interested in reading the full white paper, it's available from our website. You can download it via the link there. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Keith. And Georgie from our team is popping the links to all the reports in the chats as well. So you'll be able to see those after each speaker. So up next, we actually have John Blackburn. This is a pre-record because he's over in Italy at the moment, so it's very early in the morning. But we are happy to pass on any questions to John and facilitate connections to John. So John is from the Institute of Integrated Economics Research Australia, and he's going to be talking to Resilience and Security, Australia's Fuel Vulnerability. So Georgie, over to you. Hopefully the tech is seamless.
Good morning, I'm John Blackburn. I'm going to be talking about our fuel security situation in Australia, particularly given the crisis that we're facing at the moment. I'll talk about it in terms of national resilience, how are we going, our energy transition and the role of fuel in that, and finally, I'll raise some points about what I think we should be doing now. We are in a highly chaotic environment if you just think about the last decade. Climate change impacts, pandemics, the economic crisis, energy transition, conflict. In this chaotic situation, unfortunately, we tend to deal with everything in stovepipe manners. That causes confusion and causes a problem with trust, particularly in the government. Sadly, in the last 12 months, things have got a lot worse because of the actions of the US president and the irrational war that's happening at the moment and the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. Are we resilient enough to deal with this? Well, unfortunately, the answer to that is no. We actually react to these crises rather than preparing. And if we can't come to our energy system and fuel, 25 years ago, 40% of all our transport fuels came from Australian oil through Australian refineries, and by 2013 it was down to 10%. Right now it's about 4%. The shipping that brings that oil and fuel to Australia is all foreign owned, and that gives us a resilience problem. We've also gone in the last 12 years from around about 7 refineries down to 2, and whilst the contracts are there to extend those refineries to 2030, there does not appear to be a plan of what happens after that. So we're running on a lot of assumptions, both public assumptions, but also businesses have to do the same thing. I started writing back this in 2013, sponsored by the NRMA, and produced a series of 3 reports highlighting concerns, the last of which was trying to benchmark us against other countries. I produced this diagram at the time. This shows government-owned stocks and government-mandated stocks that industry hold across ourselves and a range of other countries. And I was quite astounded to find that we held neither. Yet all these other countries had stock totals of anything from 120 days to 90 to 67. I did ask the question why, because we alone at that time, amongst all developed oil importing countries, relied completely on the commercial market for our transport energy security. And I liken that to us contracting out our defence forces or completely outsourcing our food supply. That work eventually led to a 2015 Senate inquiry when NRMA and a range of other organisations triggered one that led to a joint standing committee inquiry into critical infrastructure in 2018, and in 2020, a liquid fuel security review. Energy Minister at the time, Angus Taylor, then initiated a series of actions, stock mandates, which came into effect in 2024, subsidies to the refineries, which are still ongoing, and some subsidies to storage facilities, which unfortunately are fairly behind schedule. If you go to the current department website and try to find out, well, what is our situation with fuels and things like that, we've got a problem. There are 3 sets of figures, whether it's IEA mandates or it's what we have in country or it's this mandated stocks from government. They're all slightly different. It's very confusing. So at a recent request of a politician, I produced a bit of a simplistic overview. And what I've tried to explain here is if we think about our fuel supply as being supply side, a logistics chain, and then a demand side, where half of all the transport fuels we use are currently diesel. The role of stocks in this system is something that I don't think either major party understands. Last week, we had the opposition leader discussing that they would have 60 days of stocks, not the current, for example, 32. And yesterday, we had the Prime Minister announce the $10 billion of funding in the next budget, part of which would go to increasing mandated stock holdings, but also the government owning some stocks. Now, that's a good step, Perhaps better late than never. But the problem we're facing is stocks are just a spring in a supply chain. They are not adequate by themselves to address our security situation because in the case of a long-term interruption, stocks will only last as long as you've actually got them for it. So we have to do a lot more than that. If we now come back and look at the situation I've already covered with no ships that can move it to refineries, we add on to that the challenge that we actually can't move fuel around the country by rail, except for a small link between Esperance and Kalgoorlie. That means the only way we move fuel is by road, and that's not feasible to do right across our country. For example, if WA needed extra supplies. We're in a situation where that logistics chain is quite fragile. It holds together in normal circumstances when there's not a conflict or a major economic crisis, but it's fragile. I liken it to an old man's artery full of cholesterol. Thankfully, we do have the stock mandates, which came in, as I mentioned, contrary to the advice from the Australian Institute of Petroleum, the lobby group for the fuel companies that said we don't need to do mandated stocks. They are too expensive. Thankfully, we did that. Otherwise, if we left it to industry, we would be in a far worse position today. So the next problem, of course, arises. 20% of the world's supply is being cut off because of the Strait. What does that mean to us? How long before it affects us? We're starting to see the effects of that last of the oil out of the Strait, having been through the refineries, has now been distributed to customers. Thankfully, we have around about 32 days of diesel. We have to remember, however, 80% of the world's supply is still running. So the total volume we'll get will be affected eventually and prices will go up. We're not going to stop having fuel completely. And thankfully with the stock, we could last for a few months to offset that loss, but eventually there will be some reduction. The problem was, of course, is public hearing 30 days without understanding the picture started to panic. And demand rose by between 50 and 100% in different areas. And that extra demand was being drawn through that logistics chain that I described before as a choked up artery. That's why we started to lose oil and fuel in various areas around the country. The government then had to come in and use the stock holding they had to put into that same distribution chain to try and overcome some of those shortages, which we caused for ourselves. So panic buying has eaten into our reserves that should be there for the import reductions. Thankfully, we have some supply leverage in this country. We export every year the equivalent to 30% of all our transport fuels as crude, oil, condensate, or liquid natural gas. Thankfully, we have that because that gives a bargaining power with the Asian refineries to give some priority for delivery of refined fuels. But this is still a problem we have to deal with because those refineries are trying to take from that reduced global supply to provide it. What do we have to think about doing in the next decade? And what my concern is when I hear announcements that are being made in government, we're talking about the pieces of this. We're not talking about the whole system. And if the system, as I view it, is supply, logistics, and demand, it makes sense you start with reducing demand. And electrification is clearly the logical path to go. There are actions in place to start that movement, but this will take decades. It's not going to happen rapidly. That's impossible. So faced where you want to have more security, better sovereign capability, you have to look at how you substitute the supply you have with fuels produced in Australia. And that's where biofuels have a central role in this. As their capacity to produce biofuels in Australia grows, that will become more and more important. There is a potential for things like gas to liquids. With the current oil reserves we have, we're largely reliant purely on importing oil because we don't have high oil reserves. I'll come back to this in a moment. The question that we have to also think about is how we produce this in Australia. There's discussion about the government initiatives of storing this in the north, and certainly in the north of Australia where the production of biofuels is more feasible. But it's not just fuel. As we've seen with this crisis, fertilizers are in short supply. So we need to think about the chemicals and other oil-based products, fertilizers being one of them, that we depend upon and how we address the sovereignty or the resilience of those supply chains as well. So the thing that hasn't been addressed that I can see adequately anyway is this in the middle. That's the logistics supply chain. Even if we grew our production capacities around the country, if we can't distribute them under our own control, in other words, we have to source foreign flank shipping, That's a major vulnerability for us. So what do we do now? Our institute's produced an options paper looking at 5 options for immediate reactions. This is not the longer term system demand, so we don't address electrification. And clearly enforcing the ethanol mandates and maximising E10 blading is highly feasible. It's a near-term capability. That production capability is here in Australia. Renewable diesels, sustainable aviation fuels, biofuels in general, very high feasibility for a medium-term sovereign capability, but we have to invest in that and support it. We've looked at other things like distributed small-scale refining, and that's probably a moderate feasibility. Gas to liquids, that's longer term. Modifying existing refineries, we don't see that really as a viable option for a whole range of reasons. But in addition to taking these initial actions, what we're saying is, how in heaven's name did we allow ourselves to get into this situation? We didn't prepare for this. We didn't prepare for the pandemic, even though the information was there. And so what we're now proposing is a parliamentary inquiry into national resilience and preparedness, because Australia does not have a knowledge problem on national resilience. It has an action problem. Australia has been warned. The warnings have been documented. And the question is whether or not whether or not we can afford to act, is can we afford not to act? We need to take action. Thanks for the opportunity of speaking with you today.
Thank you so much, John. And we will also just pop links in there to those pieces of reports that he was mentioning as well. So that will be in the chat as well. Our next speaker, delighted friend of Bioenergy Australia and of the low carbon fuels industry. So we have Max Temminghoff from CSIRO on Australia's feedstock opportunities supporting domestic supply. Over to you, Max.
Thank you very much, Shahana. Wonderful to be here. And hi, everyone. My name's Max, and I'm the low carbon fuel lead for the CSIRO Futures team. So CSIRO Futures is the strategic and economic advisory arm of the organisation. We've been looking at low carbon fuels for many years. And in 2023, we published the Sustainable Aviation Fuel Roadmap in collaboration with Boeing. Now, while that report did focus on SAF, the feedstocks that we assessed are relevant well beyond aviation, as has been established. They're also the building blocks for biodiesel, renewable diesel, ethanol, methanol, ammonia, biomethane, and LPG. So today I'm going to focus on that feedstock opportunity. What do we have? Where is it? And what does it mean for building a domestic low carbon fuels industry? Australia is in many ways spoiled for choice in terms of feedstocks. We have a rare combination of geography and capability. We've got broad latitude, diverse climates, strong agricultural productivity, and established supply chains. This gives us the ability to build a diversified feedstock portfolio rather than relying on a single pathway. And it's not just biogenic feedstocks. We also have world-class renewable energy potential, which underpins green hydrogen production, a crucial input for methanol and ammonia, which could be used by the shipping industry, as well as for upgrading and refining biofuels. In the roadmap analysis, we focused on 5 feedstock groups: carbohydrates, wastes, residues, oilseeds, and hydrogen for power to liquids. For each, we estimated current and future availability and the potential fuel output through to 2050. And we also considered the constraints like commercial viability, sustainability, policy settings, and social impacts. Just a quick note on our scope. Our modelling took a national perspective, and while that's great for sizing the opportunity and for big geographic patterns, it doesn't capture every local nuance. But since the roadmap was published, a number of states have started to progress more granular regional assessments to guide more place-based decisions about where supply chains and facilities make most sense. So keep an eye out for those. But what I'll do now is briefly walk through what each feedstock group looks like. Before we dive into the carbohydrates, a quick explainer for these graphs that applies to each feedstock. The light blue squiggly line shows the historical production data for each, with a dotted trend line over the top. From that, we did a projection line that shows our high growth scenario, which is roughly 2% per year. And the dotted horizontal line along the bottom shows the feedstock required to run a large-scale biofuel plant, producing about 300 million litres of SAF per year, plus a broadly similar volume of other fuel cuts like renewable diesel and LPG. I'll stress that these are indicative figures and will very much vary with the plant design, operating assumptions, and technologies chosen. But with that in mind, starting with carbohydrates, these are a very geographic opportunity. The strongest near-term story is in Queensland, where the East Coast sugarcane belt already has mature harvesting and milling infrastructure. And this creates a practical pathway to convert locally, reduce haulage, and keep that value onshore, turning our sugar and bagasse into fuel close to where it's produced. Sorghum adds a complementary option for the northern cropping belt of Eastern Australia, helping build a multi-region, multi-season feedstock base that can support scale over time. Australia's municipal solid waste opportunity is fundamentally an urban geography story. These feedstocks are densest around our major population centres, so the advantage is collection and aggregation at scale, with shorter transport distances and the potential for metro-adjacent processing hubs close to existing industrial infrastructure and fuel demand. Tallow availability aligns with livestock production and rendering infrastructure concentrated along key processing corridors, particularly on the East Coast. This concentration supports comparatively efficient aggregation and logistics, making tallow one of the more immediately scale-ready waste-derived feedstocks. Australia already supplies tallow into international renewable fuel supply chains, indicating established market demand and bankability. The strategic opportunity here is to retain more of that onshore. However, these realised volumes will depend on those allocation decisions across competing domestic uses and those export markets. Residues are Australia's biggest spatial opportunity and also the most logistically challenging. Broad acre farming regions, including WA's grain areas and the southern and eastern cropping zones, generate large volumes of crop residues. Forestry and sawmilling regions across parts of Victoria, New South Wales, Tasmania and Queensland provide a more pre-aggregated biomass. But the key point here is that residues largely are low density and dispersed. Although that sounds like a barrier, it also points to the solution: regional aggregation, pre-processing, and distributed feedstock hub models. And oil mallees also offer a distinctive coppicing pathway in parts of WA and South Australia, suited to more semi-arid farm landscapes and potentially complementary to land management outcomes. Oilseeds are the ready supply chain story. They're concentrated across southern and eastern cropping regions, notably WA, South Australia, Victoria and New South Wales, with established production, storage and export logistics that can be redirected into domestic upgrading where the economics stack up. The opportunity is strongest where crushing and logistics can scale efficiently. But the long-run role is likely part of a portfolio because edible oilseeds compete with food markets and face sustainability and price constraints as demand for them grows. Power to liquids is Australia's nationwide opportunity. Our comparative advantage here is renewable resource area. The regions that can host large-scale renewables and green hydrogen production are the regions that can become future fuel supply chains. In the roadmap, PTL scale links naturally to hydrogen hub geographies, typically coastal and industrial precincts, and to accessible sources of CO2 and shared infrastructure. The status of the specific projects on this map may have changed since the roadmap was published, but the underlying logic holds. PTL tends to cluster where energy, industry, ports, and pipelines can connect. The bigger message is that PTL is how Australia moves from a feedstock base that is ultimately biomass limited to one that can scale much further with clean electricity into the future. And while I'm not covering them in detail today, there's also a pipeline of emerging feedstocks like non-edible oilseeds, algae, seaweed, and biosolids that could broaden the map again over time, ease land use pressure, and strengthen resilience as technologies mature. When you add all these feedstocks up, local resources can meet a large and growing portion of Australia's jet fuel demand, but only if we build the capability to convert them here. Our analysis showed that currently Australia has enough feedstocks to produce around 60% of local jet fuel demand using biogenic feedstocks, growing to around 90% by 2050 as biogenic sources continue to grow and hydrogen production ramps up. And to be clear, these percentages are SAF only, and they don't count the additional low-carbon fuel cuts and co-products that can also come from the same conversion pathways. These estimates are also conservative, and they can move up or down depending on how much feedstock we're willing to divert away from other off-takers, especially exports. Right now, countries around the world are investing to build their SAF production capability and are purchasing the available feedstock. We're already seeing Australian tallow exported to Singapore and the US, canola historically exported to the EU for biodiesel, and wood pellets exported to Japan. If we become primarily a feedstock provider rather than integrated processor and low carbon fuel producer, we risk missing out on the broader benefits of a regional bioeconomy. Liquid fuel security for commercial and military users, local jobs in upgrading and processing feedstocks, valuable co-products such as other biofuels and biochemicals, and broader sustainability benefits from managing a complete domestic supply chain. So the feedstock opportunity is real and it's geographically distributed. The question is whether we convert them locally, keep the value onshore, or export the opportunity and import the finished product. If you're interested in learning more, give these reports a Google or reach out to me on the email displayed here. Thank you very much, and back to you, Shahana.
Thank you so much, Max. And Georgie will pop the links in the chat for those reports as well. We really appreciate it. And just a reminder, everyone, please, any questions that you have, please pop them into the Q&A section. And Georgie will, any that have made their way into the chat, they'll find their way to me, but it's easier if they're in the Q&A. So our final speaker, another friend of the industry and someone who has been around a very long time in terms of the low carbon fuels journey and sustainability. So we have Moksha Watts from the Yallaroi Group, who is going to be speaking to driving uptake, the essential role of demand side measures. Welcome, Moksha.
Thank you, Shahana. Can I just check you can see the full screen of my PowerPoint?
Sure
Excellent.
can.
Fantastic. Thank you for having me. My name is Moksha. I run an advisory firm called Yallaroi. We focus on we focus on policy decision making, supporting good policy communications and policy decision making. What I'm here to talk to you about is fill in some of the missing links, which are on how would you do this? If you were to take steps to introduce a low carbon fuels mandate or a measure, how could you do this? So we looked at what could be a sensible design particularly for a national road fuel mandate. We conducted research and a range of interviews, including with some experts and with producers. And what I'll do is I'll run through what we would suggest. Now, this is what I would call an informed straw person, noting that we don't have a full line of sight into the considerations within any federal or state government. I'd also note that this focus our focus has been on the federal government rather than what you could do in the federal sphere rather than the states, although it has been informed by the experience of state mandates.
Moksha,
yes.
Just quickly, we are going to now a version that is your PowerPoint version instead of full screen mode.
Okay. Just bear with me. Apologies.
Perfect.
There we go. Okay. There we go. Now, others have covered the context that would shape policy design, but if I could just summarize very quickly, there were 5 broad themes that shaped the policy designs that we looked at. First, that this is an entrenched disruption. With the traffic from the Strait of Hormuz down to less than 10%, in fact, I think it's 2 or 3% of pre-conflict levels, supply is not expected to normalise for some time. The second piece of context was that these kinds of trade and geopolitical disruptions are becoming the new norm. And so we would assume that the fuel shock signal is a signal of a less predictable global order. The third piece of context, which others have spoken about, is that Australia can produce a meaningful amount of fuel-grade ethanol and biodiesel, but is on track for a less than 40% utilisation rate at the moment. The fifth piece of context is the fourth piece of context is that it's demand, not supply, that is the gap. At the moment, wholesale ethanol, and it has been for some time, is cheaper than U91. Biodiesel is at parity with mineral diesel today. And if I look at the context around, lastly, the last context point is that we have a fleet that's ready. These are the same cars that are made in or imported to markets that currently have mandates. So US, UK, EU, they're the same vehicles and they need to be compatible there. The US in particular, it has had a renewable fuel standard in place for over 30 years now, and 98% of the fuel sold in the US is an ethanol blend today. The EU is similar. There's 17 member states that have mandates in place. And in the UK, the standard petrol that's sold is an E10 blend. So what we developed was a proposal which is would both be a stopgap and a long-term signal. And I'll focus a little bit on the stopgap, which would be a modest binding low carbon fuel blending mandate, which would activate underutilized production within 30 to 60 days. It displaces imported fuel litre for litre. It prevents permanent loss of capacity. The story that John shared about our oil refineries is not unlike what is happening in the biofuels sector as well, particularly for road biofuels. And a mandate could be brought in with existing physical infrastructure and existing policy infrastructure. There's a range of excise data that's already collected. Of course, as others have spoken, there is a need to evolve to what would be a sovereign fuel strategy, which covers road, aviation, and maritime fuels. It anchors the investments that have already been made by the government and the private sector. It builds on the certification work that's underway and is importantly activated through a durable demand side framework. What we looked at were some of the lessons from the two mandates that do exist today in New South Wales and Queensland. And just to call out the New South Wales example, because there's better data available there, New South Wales has currently a mandate for 6% of the fuel pool, the retail fuel pool. But as of January 2026, that is actually at 2.5%, and it's the lowest it's been for some years. Also, just to call out, 100% of the covered entities, what they call the volume fuel retailers, in that mandate hold active exemptions and have done had done by December 2022. So there are 4 design failures that are worth bearing in mind here. Firstly, those mandates are what we would say on the wrong obligated party, that they've been placed on retailers who for the largest extent don't control the blending decisions or the upstream supply. And to some extent, they've had to be that way. I understand due to constitutional issues, but that's been one of the design features that has restricted the coverage of the mandate. The second is that the scope has been predominantly on retail, so particularly in New South Wales. 1.4 billion litres of New South Wales petrol moves through non-retail channels, and that's been an impact. The third is that product definitions, for example, in Queensland, have not been very rigorous. So you can have fuel sold in Queensland that can contain very little ethanol, but still be able to be sold as E10. And fourthly, the exemptions are quite easy and straightforward to get. They're often self-declared, they're prospective, they're uncapped, and they've not been enforced. There have been no prosecutions in either state. So what we would propose or suggest for discussion is that the obligation should move upstream to where the blending decision is actually made. So take the obligation from retailers and place it on the importers or the refiners, which would actually hit the blending decision point. It captures the entire national fuel pool, and importantly, that it would be a volumetric target. So instead of saying 1% of all fuel, of all petrol or diesel is a biofuel, you could have a volumetric target which allows those importers to be flexible about blending where it's most economical. And a short-term measure could potentially alleviate our crisis now, but to send a genuinely enduring signal to bring on new production, you of course need long-term certainty. So a legislated escalator would be important, and this is an indicative one, but you could start in FY27, which is almost upon us, with a volumetric target, which is 80% of nameplate capacity of our current producers. And that would be able to get you 144 million litres of fuel-grade ethanol and 44 million litres of biodiesel almost immediately. And within a year, you could get that to 100% and then beyond. The enforcement would be another issue that would need to be adjusted. So the state, particularly in New South Wales, the penalties are criminal, which is a very high threshold. It requires court prosecution. You would want to move that to a civil debt kind of charge, a civil shortfall charge. It's per litre charge enforced by the Commonwealth through the Clean Energy Regulator, which is modelled on what happens with some other mechanisms already, which the Clean Energy Regulator sees through. You could have capacity adjustments, but for genuine supply shortfalls. And there are carry forward provisions that would be needed to have some flexibility, but really only where domestic supply is genuinely insufficient. And in terms of the legislation pathway, it can be relatively straightforward for road fuels. So the Fuel Quality Standards Act, which is the main instrument the Commonwealth uses, it's been amended twice during this crisis already. So you could have another amendment which gives the minister or the decision maker the power to impose a volume-based mandate. That's a very small change in the legislation, and that leads to triggers regulations that would then bring in the size of the mandate and how it would work in practice. So very quickly from government decision to bill drafting to an inquiry through Parliament and passage, you could have a scheme commencing that creates meaningful domestic fuels into our mix. And I might just stop with that and say, as I've mentioned, there could be some additional ways to do this, but this is one way that we have looked at, which could provide the Commonwealth both the ability to have an immediate stopgap and pave the way, give them time to be able to design the longer term measures that are needed. Thanks, Shahana.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Moksha. And now we'll welcome all of our panelists to join the screen while we have a bit of a chat. So please feel free to pop those questions into the Q&A box. We do have a few in there. So I'm probably going to, as Moksha, you just finished off, I'm going to go to you first. So I'm interested to understand from you, you've obviously been focusing on the immediacy and the immediate opportunity of the existing low carbon fuels industry. And so what do you see are really those key risks if we don't implement a demand side measure, in the very near future?
Yeah, thanks, Shahana. I mean, firstly, what I would say is that we have production, as I mentioned, we have production capacity which is not being utilised now. We are utilising less than half of what we can produce. There is also an increase in interest, as we understand, from those seeking to import Australian ethanol to meet their own fuel supply needs in this current crisis. So the ability to leverage existing infrastructure and existing feedstocks, existing capability is there and should be taken advantage of. I know another speaker talked about feedstocks. Australia is the largest exporter of tallow in the world. We export 80% of our feedstocks today. So there's an opportunity to very quickly bring those feedstocks into the domestic production supply chain. So I would say that there's risks around that. And I would say that the design of a longer term mandate should not stop some measures that have been well understood and have been in place, not only in Australia, but in other countries. As another speaker said, there are 64 countries that do this now. So we're really an outlier in some respects.
Yeah, great. And following on from that, we have had a question that's popped into the chat here, and feel free others that may want to join in on this one. But what are the current prohibitors to government action, such as the policy kind of recommendations that have been discussed here today, at a federal or state level? So, Moksha, I think obviously based on your background, I think you probably have a good insight into why the Australian government at a federal level probably hasn't progressed this space over the recent time.
And so what I suppose, Shahana, you're referring to is that my most recent background before Yallaroi has been in the federal government. I was in the Prime Minister's office as his climate change and energy advisor. And without speaking to any of the deliberations then, more generally, I would just make the observation that the urgency hasn't been felt. So we've not had any, as we do now, that political opportunity to do something. And I would also say that structurally, the industry, it's both commercially and operationally structured to process imported fuel. So you need to have a policy signal. That policy signal has been necessary in those 64 countries to be able to introduce another form of fuel into the existing supply chain.
Fantastic. I might jump to a question for Max, and this question has come through. I noticed that there isn't a lot of discussion about the implementation of third generation feedstocks such as pongamia, pinnata, or algae and oil production, which is best suited for Australia. Keen, Max, on your kind of thoughts on those particular feedstocks and where they sit in the pie moving forward.
Yeah, thanks, Shahana. And I'll just say for our report, we didn't look at these more emerging ones due to the lack of data at the time. But what we have seen over the last few years is much greater interest in where these could be grown most efficiently, what they could add to that existing pool. And that's something that CSIRO is considering as well, is where should some of these feedstocks most efficiently be located so as not to take away land from other feedstocks that might be better placed there. And so we're looking at a bit of a map to say, if you were in this certain latitude and longitude of Queensland, what are the best suited feedstocks there to make the most of the rainfall and the conditions there? So there's a range of feedstocks out there, and there are many different technology providers looking at them. So things like the carinata seed, which is an alternative for canola, which can be grown in areas that perhaps are a bit more arid, that could provide an extra boost of supply. But I'd say that the jury is still out about which ones and where, but I can assure you that there's plenty of R&D being looked at to see which would be most suitable and what they might be able to bring to the overall pool of feedstocks that we have.
Great, thanks, Max. We've got a question here. Moksha, actually, I think Moksha, Joe, Max, Keith, you probably might all have a view on this one. But wanting to, I suppose, have panelists weigh in on the conversation around the financial cost of building resilience and redundancy into our fuel system, especially in, the context of inflation and high cost of living. And so how can we convince the Australian public of the value, whether it is the value through, government taxpayer funded dollars or through consumers paying a bit more to secure our fuel future. So yeah, Keen, maybe Moksha, did you want to jump on that one first, and then I might go to Keith?
Just very quickly, I mean, firstly, I would say the picture's not universal. So yes, some of these biofuels have a cost premium, but not all. As I mentioned, the wholesale price of ethanol, for example, is, New South Wales, it's capped at 158 cents per litre or something. It is materially lower than the cost of unleaded petrol at that wholesale level. Whereas the picture is different for other fuels. So that's one thing. It's not an even picture. The second thing, I mean, I'm really now speaking what I think John Blackburn would say, which is that the notion that this is a small disruption and things will normalize is probably not borne out by the facts of the last couple of years, that we are looking at potentially a permanently changed set of geostrategic circumstances. And so in that situation, there is a case to be mounted for ensuring that there is energy security and reliance that is, a different order of magnitude to what we've enjoyed previously. So, have Australian people been able to be convinced of these sort of arguments? Yes. I mean, you look at where we've been at COVID or with other shocks and crises in the past. People do understand that you need to ensure security and reliability. You've seen a spike in electric vehicles and solar panels and batteries. People have indicated with their hip pockets that they are willing to pay for security.
Fantastic. Keith, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I'll just comment on the premise that overseas they've proven that ethanol and biodiesel, for instance, can be very competitive against conventional fuels. But our industry got off to a very slow start. It's very small by international standards. It's very small scale. And other countries, particularly the USA, put in policies to secure their fuel security, which made it more economic for Australian feedstock suppliers to sell their tallow and vegetable oils to Europe and America, rather than for it to be used in Australia. And because Australia didn't act, our smaller plants were starved of feedstocks and they've gone overseas to expand the industry overseas. And the industry overseas is huge. So other countries have seen the importance of fuel security, but it's been largely driven by government decision to create incentives and to drive the industry to grow. We haven't had that government support in Australia. It's been left to the industry as a voluntary thing to grow. And they've just struggled because there hasn't been the same structure that other countries have put in place. As I said before, 63 countries have mandates for ethanol, for instance. Unless there is structure in government legislation to drive these things, the industry is just left to flounder. And we actually don't get the cheaper prices unless we get scale and the size of an industry. And there are biodiesel plants in Indonesia which are 1 billion litres a year, way, way bigger than anything we have in Australia. And you do get the economies of scale once you establish an industry and make it larger. But we've never got to the point of growing the industry because it's been left by itself. And that's not the way that other countries have grown their industries.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Keith. Following on from that, sorry, Joe, did you want to jump
Charlie,
in?
yeah, sorry if I just jump in.
Yeah.
Maybe another quick point on that is to look at almost the economic opportunity that this could represent, particularly for regional and rural Australians. There has been the rollout of renewable energy in regional and rural Australia, and there's obviously been some challenges with that. But when we come to low carbon liquid fuels and the expansion and the refining of those, there is some very concrete opportunities to really leverage the strengths of our agricultural sector to provide secure, well-paid, good jobs in regional and rural Australia, particularly in Queensland and Western Australia, which can really help to kind of drive, I guess, a new economic dividend in those regions. I think the Hammer Energy facility in Portland, that's something like a couple of hundred ongoing jobs. We looked, I think, for the report we did with you at some of the US, larger facilities. I think one of those had around 1,400 jobs, 40% operational, the rest in indirect. So there is really a sort of an economic opportunity here that can be shown to the public.
Yeah, great. Interesting question, and it's certainly something that there's quite a bit of discussion amongst the industry on this one. So keen, probably Moksha and Keith, you might weigh in on this one. Is an ethanol mandate for road vehicles a critical enabler to enhancing the viability of alcohol to jet projects being considered in Australia? Seems they go hand in hand in industry development policy. So keen to Moksha.
Yeah, look, we looked at this question, and I know there's, as with all these things, there's a lot of debate, but the experience internationally certainly has been that, and another piece of work we did with Bioenergy, we looked particularly at the landscape around Asia. The countries that are leading today with SAF production or with renewable diesel production started a long time ago with biodiesel and ethanol production. And that build up in infrastructure, in capability, that's been, looks like it has been a meaningful contributor. So they had started to pivot some of their road fuel production into SAF, and was happening at scale at the start of this crisis at least. And so I would fully expect that those kinds of changes would happen here as well if you had the right policy signals in place. So yeah, certainly the international experience has been that one has helped to build up capability for the other.
Great. Keith, anything to add?
Yeah, I'd agree with that. And certainly there's no downside to developing a ethanol capability, because down the track it can be used to act as a feedstock for alcohol to jet technology, which can make ethylene for plastics. It can make sustainable aviation fuel and renewable diesel in the long term. So ethanol has the potential to become the new crude oil in the future, because it can displace plastic feedstocks as well, which we get conventionally from refineries today. But in terms of building up that capability, you've got to start somewhere, and the mandate is critical to giving people business confidence to invest in ethanol projects. You've got to have guaranteed offtake. And you can do that today by putting in an ethanol mandate and getting into fuel. Down the track, as SAF plants start to get developed and you put in mandates to start building SAF, they'll start wanting to buy alcohol too. But you've got to build industry capability.
Awesome. Max, I might jump to you. We've had a few questions that have come through regarding sustainability. So what about the sustainability of feedstock in climate change scenarios, and that potentially could impact biomass production? And another one there about basically looking at what is the sustainability principles that underpin biomass, and how is it more sustainable than fossil-based fuels?
Sure, thanks for that one, Shahana. So each feedstock that I spoke about earlier, each has its own sustainability considerations and its own calculations behind its life cycle assessment. So, when we were talking about sustainable aviation 3 years ago, the focus really was on where you're going to get your most bang for your buck in terms of decarbonisation. And that's where things like canola got a bit of a penalty. So compared to conventional jet fuel, the reduction's only about 30% in terms of the life cycle emissions that you'll get. So when you're thinking about that purely from a sustainability angle, it perhaps isn't as attractive as something like tallow, where you get closer to 100% because it's a waste product that needs to get rid of effectively. That conversation's obviously changing a lot right now, where you could imagine that your average person in Australia who wants to be able to drive around doesn't really care how much the carbon reduction is if we're making that fuel from canola grown here in Australia. So I think that sustainability question is changing a little bit, but it is certainly, as we look to 2050, a very key consideration about if we're getting towards net zero, which feedstocks are going to get us there. But again, the point you made earlier about ethanol being kind of a progressive use in different fuels, I think we have to think about that when it comes to bio feedstocks with something like canola, where it's there, it's ready to go, it's really good for now. And then we look at over the longer term, how do we transition to more sustainable oilseeds, such as carinata that I discussed before, where you don't get as many penalties because you're not taking away from the food production line. So there are options and ways to get us to that 2050 desired net zero. We might just have to build out capability now using the less desirable from a carbon reduction point of view today. But I think we're all still working towards the same goal, which is net zero.
Great, thanks, Max. I'm not too sure if we have a speaker that will be able to answer this one for you, Peter, but he's curious about the potential to ramp up bio-LNG production as there is a rapid uptake from maritime fuel demand. Given we export significant amount of LNG, how are we positioned to meet this demand? Max, have you got any insights on that one, or Keith?
Yeah, so biomethane comes up quite a lot, kind of in starts and bursts, and I think we're having another burst here. As you referred to there, the shipping industry is currently going through a bit of an exercise to work out, will it be ammonia, will it be methanol, will it be LPG, will it be LNG that'll help them decarbonise? And I think there is a bit of a renewal of looking at biomethane. And Australia has a lot of potential when it comes to biomethane, but of course capturing that has its own challenges. And I think we've seen a perspective come out from Austrade quite recently, so I'd encourage you to look at that. That kind of seeks to quantify what that opportunity is. And yeah, good thing about biomethane is it has so many different uses. We could be making plastics, we could be powering our industry, we could be using it as a fuel. So I think I think someone mentioned earlier that there will be a range of options available. It's going to be very much horses for courses, and I think that's certainly one of the horses in the race is biomethane for Australia.
Johanna, maybe just to jump in and build
Yeah.
on Max's last question around sort of sustainability of the different feedstocks in a changing climate. We, in some work we did for CEFC, set out essentially a sort of feedstock ladder for Australia, as Max was talking about, the sort of some of the HEFA pathways coming out first. But as you kind of move down that ladder and you look sort of more sort of medium term, there's some really interesting opportunities in areas like municipal solid waste, where there is an interesting interaction between the sort of declining landfill capacity in certain parts of the country, the ability to have a sort of steady stream of feedstock inputs and aggregate across council areas, and the economics of that sort of changing as particularly sort of councils have to pay for landfill. So there's obviously those for the biogenic or the agriculture based feedstocks, some of the considerations Max mentioned are really important. But even if we look sort of 5-10 years down the line, some really interesting opportunities in other feedstocks that may be less impacted as the climate changes.
Yeah, great. And I think this is probably a question that a few might jump in on. I agree you can make the industry cost efficient if larger, I'll jump into. In Australia, we operate mid-size plants, which are not operating efficiently. So that's the statement. I ask why there is no discussion about decentralized, small scale, local processing, lower cost, lower carbon, readily available. So keen on, I suppose, looking at that more smaller distributed model around processing or even pre-processing and the role that potentially could play moving forward. Who wants to have a go? Max?
Yeah, I'll start off. Totally agree. I think one of the biggest challenges of developing these biofuel supply chains is the logistics. It's collecting these usually low density feedstocks and bringing them to a centralized site. And there is a bit of a kind of a tug and pull about balancing those large scale benefits that you get from scaling these plants versus getting your costs down for logistics, and shifting to a more decentralized supply chain rather than having 2 or 3 large refineries is certainly looking quite attractive, and building these close to where the feedstock is sourced. So especially when we look at things like agricultural residues, which is arguably our largest opportunity, however our most difficult logistically, to minimize technology risk, minimize costs, bringing these refineries close to those regions is probably the way to go. That's what we're hearing. That's what we can say qualitatively, and we'd love to be able to say so quantitatively one day as well, because that's certainly what the numbers are pointing to.
Yeah, great. Keith?
Yeah, I might add to that certainly when you're master planning these sort of projects, the most expensive thing out there is to collect and collate the feedstocks to the biomass. It's very low density, very high volume, and very expensive to transport. So it makes a lot of sense to process it as close to the source as possible. So if you're making canola oil, for instance, to process into heifer plants. Actually processing that canola in the regions to make canola oil and then transporting the oil to a centralised heifer project makes a lot of sense there, rather than transporting all that canola to a major city and then processing it there, because it's a lot of transport costs. And certainly bigger plants are generally cheaper to operate than smaller, but you want to operate the most effectively to get the logistics as cheap as possible. And even if the world of alcohol to jet fuel plants, for instance, where you're processing those biomass feedstocks in the regions, whether it be sugar, for instance, or whatever, process it as close to the source, make your ethanol, and then send the ethanol to a centralized larger alcohol to jet fuel biorefinery. Makes a lot of sense. And you might have numerous alcohol plants, ethanol plants, for instance, and then a bigger single alcohol to jet fuel plant. So I think you've got to minimize your costs, minimize your logistics, and then maximize the size of the plants where it makes sense, because they need to be accessed to ports to distribute the products.
Great. Moksha, did you want to add to that or nothing? No, awesome. Keith, while I've got you there, this is one that hopefully you'll be able to jump in on. So there was some discussion in the chat around efficiency implications. So the question is there an efficiency reduction through the use of biofuels or blended fossil biofuels? Keen to have you jump in on that one, Keith.
Yeah, there's a lot of experience with biofuels, particularly overseas. In America, they blend all of their petrol with as E10. And ethanol does indeed have a difference in energy content to petrol. And if you look at the energy content alone, E10 should have a theoretical loss of energy of around about 3%. And certainly early on, there was a discussion that you would expect 3% less fuel economy with ethanol. However, ethanol is added as a oxygenate in America via the legislation there, because it does have additional oxygen and it actually promotes more complete combustion. So with modern cars, the fuel efficiency of E10 is actually often better than 3% and can be in that difference of about 1 to 3%, depending on the age of the car. Certainly in the world of biodiesel, there are biodiesel fully compliant buses and trucks which are on our roads today. You can buy them off the shelf from people like Scania, Mercedes, major brands. And you can buy a prime mover today that will run on standard diesel or biodiesel, and they'll run very efficiently on either. They've done a lot of work in that area. Europe uses a lot of biodiesel buses and trucks. They are widely used throughout the world.
Great. We've got one here, Moksha, that you might want to jump in on. So Dave has just said that he heard Moksha talk about us being the world's largest exporter of tallow, similar to LNG. However, we now have LNG reservation requirements that ensure local demand must be satisfied before exports can occur. Why are we not pursuing a consistent requirement for agricultural exports in Australia, such as tallow, especially if existing biodiesel plants are sitting underutilized? It's a tricky one to get in on. Max, you might want to, and Joe as well. Over to you, Moksha.
So what I would say, I mean, firstly, what's fundamentally different is that there isn't a market here at the moment. That's what this discussion has been about. So it's being exported because there are other jurisdictions with policy or other requirements that want our tallow or our other feedstocks, and we don't. So it's a very different dynamic to gas, and that's where the government's taken the steps it's taken over the last day, particularly on the East Coast. So that's one thing. The second, this is what we heard in doing this work, is that for the most part, the feedstock export structure is pretty seasonal. They're not long-term supply agreements. It's a very different industry to how LNG has come about in Australia. And you take on, as an exporter, you take on quite a lot of risk in putting your feedstock on a ship and sending it to Europe or somewhere in Asia. In that, it's not only long distances, complex logistics, but also you're only really paid at the other end if the product meets those certifications. So it's a more volatile and risky situation than some other industries. And so if you had a meaningful demand signal here, you would not need to have, this is where we heard, you would not need to have anything like a tariff restriction, something as extreme as that, to create meaningful supply here. But I think, others may also have views on that.
I might just pop in on that if I may. If you go back 15 years ago, we had 8 biodiesel plants. And tallow back then was around about $1 a litre. And the feedstock is a major cost component for making biodiesel. It's got a huge influence on the price. And people were prepared to pay $1.20, $1.30 for biodiesel blends. But the rest of the world started putting in incentives to grow their biofuels industries. And then all of a sudden, the price of tallow was $2 a litre because it was going to Singapore to go into biofuels manufacture and also go into Europe for making biodiesel because their industries were supported by government incentives. And so the farmers and the abattoirs, they follow where they get the best price for their product. And they were offered $2 a litre for the tallow, and the same with the canola oil was being offered a lot more money for overseas. And it got to the point where the Australian producers could not find a market for their products because their feedstocks were increasing in cost because of what other countries were prepared to pay. And it was only on the backbone of government incentives to promote their biofuels. So whilst we did nothing, other countries took our feedstocks away. So Australia either has to limit those feedstocks going off overseas, and that's going to be tough because the producers wanting the best return on their investment, or offer similar incentives to provide biofuels growth here in Australia with certain offtakes. But it's actually wasn't unaffordable. It's just that other countries have put incentives in place to grow their industries and we haven't.
But maybe Shahana, just to build on Keith and Moksha's point there, when we think about industry development and building new industries, which in much cases this is, we often think about policy for the demand side, policy for the supply side, and policy that enables those two parts of the market to work together. Australian policy in the past few years has been very focused on the supply side, whether it's and those kind of enabling areas. And we're doing okay on that. We've got the Guarantee of Origin scheme, which is progressing. There are supply side subsidies available through ARENA and through the Cleaner Fuels program. But the challenge is, as Moksha alluded to, there isn't that policy on the demand side. And therefore, without those three types of instrument kind of working together, it's very hard for the industry to grow to the scale that we have the potential to be.
Right. Look, we've got 3 minutes left. So on the spot, I haven't asked any of the speakers ahead of time to consider this, but I guess here we are in the midst of this fuel security crisis. We have a low carbon fuels industry that's here today, ready to support, and one into the future that is really going to potentially play a significant role. So I'm keen to hear from each of you, what is, that one thing, and you can't all say the same thing. So if one says the one we're all thinking of first, then you have to actually come up with what's the next thing that's needed, okay? So I'm going to go to Moksha first because, she's my favorite.
So I will, Shahana, not say the thing that I assume everyone's thinking of, but what I would add is that as well as supply and demand measures, I think that what Joe alluded to in the thing in the middle to connect them, I also think that governments have to think smartly about the role they play in that middle space. So whether it's as an off-taker, whether it's as an underwriter, those sort of abilities to connect, to be a credit-worthy party in the middle to connect supply and demand, that is going to be really meaningful in lowering the cost of capital that this new infrastructure comes with. Where this is about creating a new market. This is market formation policies that we're talking about, and the role that governments have played internationally in through smart off-taking and underwriting and using the government balance sheet smartly, that can't be underestimated. So Singapore is a great example of how they've introduced their SAF mandate. They've got a central procurer and they've got a levy that applies fairly and evenly across all customers. And that means that the outcome is as efficient as possible. So that's what I would say.
Great. Joe?
The only thing I would add is that we need to look at policy from a holistic approach rather than thinking kind of one big bang thing, particularly one big bang supply side measure is going to solve everything. We need that kind of holistic view across those three parts.
Great. Keith?
Yeah, I think in context, the notable thing about where we sit today is everybody's been talking about SAF because SAF projects are drop-in products. Admittedly, they're 50% blending today, but the airlines are prepared to embrace SAF, and most importantly, they are prepared to sign off-take agreements. You know, companies like Qantas have stood up in Australia and said they're prepared to sign off-take agreements, and it's driving a lot of project development. And they are great for the long term. They won't be implemented tomorrow. There's a lot of projects under development. But ultimately, the opportunity with biofuels from the first generation with E10 and B5 are not drop-in fuels, and they need to be blended into existing fuels. And that's where the role of the magic word mandates has a role, because individual companies can't step up and say, I want to buy ethanol for my fuel, because you can't run 100% ethanol in your vehicles. It has to come as E10. So that's where the government has a role to play to grow these industries. But ultimately, your low carbon liquid fuels, they're seeing a lot of popularity today because individual companies can step up and actually act as the offtake agreement. And that's what's required for people to get investment.
Awesome. Max?
Well, apart from more money into R&D and more money into our science institute, I think education is a big piece here. So I think, people, what do you mean putting ethanol into my car? What do you mean my plane's running on canola oil? That doesn't sound safe. I think bringing everyone along for this ride, rather than just telling them that this is going to improve our fuel security, I think that's really important to make sure that everyone feels safe in this journey. So that's what I'll say.
Awesome. Well, look, thank you so much to all of the panelists and speakers that we had today. Really appreciate it. It was a great session. We are planning another session in 2 weeks' time. So dial back in 2 weeks. We'll have another fuel security session that we will be hosting, and looking forward to promoting that probably around the middle of next week. Fingers crossed, there's some exciting things coming. We're doing everything we can from the Industry Association to position the industry to be ready to go and support the government. So have a wonderful weekend, everybody, and thanks again for joining.
Thanks, Shahana. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Shahana. Thanks, everyone.